might still wander in, so I'll leave the door open for the time being. You should have had invitations to the whole series of events we have running in the run up to the elections. We, all but one, are here at the Institute for Government. Because it's such a busy place, unfortunately there was one day we couldn't do, so we're going to be over at 1 Great George Street. So today we're looking at London, specifically at London. Next Tuesday it's overview of the local elections nationally with Colin Rawlings, Michael Flasher and John Curtis. Then on the 7th of May we're looking at the European elections in the UK, very much a UK perspective. The week after that, on the 13th of May, it's very much the European angle. What is going to be the outcome of the elections across Europe? What are the implications, and how is that going to feed back to debates about referendum and such like in the UK? We're delighted Tony could do this London briefing. There really isn't anybody else who has the standard. So it is the Tony Travers show today. We thought long and hard, was there anybody who could add anything else? And really, there isn't, and I think that's testament to Tony's expertise rather than a reflection on the discipline as a whole.
Okay, right, thank you very much, and good morning all. What I'll do, if I may, is to go through a set of slides which you've already got, which are pretty self-explanatory, and then perhaps say a few more words at the end of these slides about the general implications of these elections, given that there is this extremely rich patch of elections this year, the locals and Euros coming up next month, then Scotland, and then soon after the general election, obviously all these feeding their way, each feeds into the other. What I'd just like to do is to begin by just describing the system of subnational government in London. The planetary system, consisting as it does of the Greater London Authority, created in 2000, consisting of a mayor and assembly, which was elected last in 2012, next in 2016. It, of course, is elected on the basis of two different voting systems, one for the mayor, one for the assembly, both of them, of course, different voting systems to those used for the boroughs, which continue to use the first past the post system. The boroughs were last elected in 2010, which is on general election day, which is important, and I'll come back to that. The London boroughs have all-out elections every 4 years, and this is one of those years. So, unlike the metropolitan districts, which Colin and Michael will be talking about next week, which are elected in thirds, in 3 years out of 4, this is a full London-wide election, and in that sense, a very good test across a part of the country that is in its way quite similar to Britain as a whole politically, of what is going on at the time. I'll say a bit more about that soon. There are mayoral elections in Hackney, Lewisham, Newham, and in a sense most excitedly in Tower Hamlets. These use the same supplementary vote system as the London mayor and other mayors outside London. And then we must never forget the City of London, with its unique voting system, which I haven't attempted to summarise, which was elected last year and next in 2017, with, as I say, a unique franchise, the Common Council, rather different to other local authorities, and its own Lord Mayor. I won't be saying anything else about that today. Now, what I've tried to do here is to look at the vote share in the London Borough Elections right the way back to 1968. In fact, the first London Borough Elections took place in 1964. They were just before the boroughs came into existence in 1965. Worth adding that the London boroughs are, by the standards of British public authorities, antique. They are 50 years old. They started work in 1965. Given how often everything is reorganised in Britain, except Parliament obviously, these are antique political institutions, 50 years old. And you can see, and this is not surprising because it's happened across the UK, how the Labour plus Conservative vote has come down over time. This is a phenomenon we know. It's not unique to London by any means, but the Conservative plus Labour vote, which typically was in the 90% mark in the past, is now down to something closer to 65 or 70%. Corresponding, at least up till now, growth in the Liberal Democrat vote and to some extent in the other vote. There are 1,861 councillors in London currently. There were slightly fewer actually after these elections. There was some warding going on. And if you, this table unhelpfully reads, which I just copied from the Greater London Authority publication, runs from bottom to top. So the top result was last time, 2010, and you can see that the Conservatives lost about 70 seats last time. Labour gained about 90 there. The Lib Dems lost substantial numbers relative to their starting point. In fact, the general election was on that day, so it turned out to be rather a good day for Labour. The visible Labour vote that came out with a higher turnout, making those relatively good elections for Labour. I should say, please stop me as I go along. I can just talk until you feel free to stop me if you want. Now, this is a brilliantly designed chart, which I never always have to double check. You read horizontally for what happened in 2010. So if you read down on the left-hand side there, and it says Conservative 2010, and then read across, you'll see that the boroughs they won in any of the boxes right, and where you read down, you'll see if they won them last time from somebody else. So to take Richmond upon Thames, it was won by the Conservatives in 2010 from the Liberal Democrats who held it in 2006. That's all this table shows you. And where you see LD 2010 meeting LD 2006, that's that one that says Kingston on Thames and Sutton. That's one where there was no change in control. So put the other way around, where there is a list of councils in a box which is not shaded in, that is one where there were changes in control. And you can see that actually Labour did rather well in terms of taking control either from the Conservatives in Ealing, Enfield and Harrow, or from no overall control in Brent, Camden, Hounslow, Islington, Lewisham, Southwark and Waltham Forest. So it was a good night, both in terms of councils won and indeed reasonably in terms of vote share back in 2010 for Labour. This is just a chart showing that in 2010 Labour won 17 councils, which is a good total by their standards over time. The Conservatives 11, the Lib Dems 2, no overall control 2. In fact, since then, and particularly latterly, as reselection time has come up and there have been unhappy councillors who have defected, the number of no overall control councillors has gone up somewhat, and the number of Conservative ones gone down somewhat. But that's the pattern in 2010, and of course, just for comparative purposes, the position in 2006, where the Labour Party only had 7 councils and the Conservatives 13, the Lib Dems had 3, so they lost 1 in 2010. Now, which boroughs looking into this year's elections are safe? Now, of course, I put these slides together knowing they are hostages of fortune and they will all be printed and ready when something different happens in the elections next month. It looks to me as if for Labour, the list here, Barking and Dagenham, Camden, Greenwich, Hackney, Haringey, Islington, Lambeth, Lewisham, Newham, Southwark and Waltham Forest are all pretty well safe for Labour. The Conservatives, Bromley, Hillingdon, Kensington, Chelsea, Westminster and Wandsworth, safe. And for the Lib Dems, are at least certain about this. Sutton is a pretty embedded council for the Lib Dems, limpet-like Liberal Democrat behaviour there, I think. So this one looks safe-ish for them. The more marginal ones, but where there is likely to be no change, include these Labour councils of Brent, Ealing, Enfield and Hounslow. The Conservative ones, Hammersmith and Fulham, interesting Hammersmith and Fulham, used to be a borough where Labour would win typically over time. but it has, for demographic reasons, and also because of the low council tax policy, which was the Westminster pioneered, Hammersmith and Fulham, I think, is shifting, and I'll show you why a bit later, shifting to the right over time. Bexley, very different place, but with a particular kind of Conservative who looked to me to be reasonably adept at keeping the UKIP threat at bay. But again, that'll be a big test if they can do that, because the Bexley will appear again later on as somewhere where UKIP has done relatively well in the past. Richmond, where the Lib Dems and the Conservatives face each other off, no Labour challenge at all there, given what we know about the swing from the Lib Dems to Conservatives since the last election. You have to say Richmond looks pretty safe for the Conservatives to hold. Barnet, more marginal, Conservative Labour margin, Barnet, but on balance you have to say most likely not to change, though it is of this list the most likely, I think, to change. These are not predictions, these are ones where I think there may well be change. So Conservative to Labour, Croydon and Redbridge. Now, Croydon and Redbridge are both places, I'll show in a moment, where over the long term the Conservatives poll better than the London average, but where Labour has been polling better over time relative to the London average. So these are very marginal boroughs. Redbridge actually is currently no overall control. Croydon is Conservative control. But you have to say that on balance, take into account the reduced turnout on the one hand, which will probably help Conservatives relatively, and disadvantage Labour relatively, but the swing from the Conservatives to Labour since 2010, these look quite possibly Conservative to Labour switches. Conservative to no overall control. Havering is the far east borough, one on the border with Essex, surrounded by Essex, and the river. Essex has complicated politics, lots of independents at the best of time. There's been defections recently, likely I suspect to go from Conservative to NOC. Well, I think it hasn't really gone to NOC, but to stay like that. It used to be Conservative control at the last election. Burton, currently a Labour minority council, so technically no overall control, likely to go to Labour. Tower Hamlets politics, I'm not sure I've even dared to put this in. Complex in many, many ways, could go from Labour to NOC. In fact, Labour's quite strong in Tower Hamlets, despite the fact that the mayor is an independent. So I put a big question mark by that one, definitely. Kingston, currently held by the Lib Dems. You have to say on the basis of the general swing in polling from the Lib Dems to the Conservatives relatively, you have to say that this was likely a Conservative gain, again not a prediction. Harrow, the politics of Harrow are wonderfully complicated. I think at the moment there's a Conservative minority administration which may actually have Labour support, something like that anyway. There are a number of splits in Harrow politics. There was a year, not that long ago, when the Liberal Democrats failed to get all their registration papers in, and so no candidates, virtually no candidates at all. So I wouldn't like to predict that, so I've gone for the ever-popular NOC no change prediction, but I might be wrong with that, as with all of these. There are mayoral elections, as I said, in Hackney, Lewisham, Newham and Tower Hamlets. It's hard to believe, given what else we know about A, the reasonable popularity of their mayors, and B, polling, that Hackney, Lewisham and Newham will not stay Labour. They're relatively safe Labour places. I think in 2 of the 3 of them last time, the mayor got over 50% in the first ballot, so it's unlikely they're going to change. And in fact, these are relatively, that way a political comment, seem to be relatively well-run places under their current administration. Tower Hamlets, what to say about Tower Hamlets that I haven't said already. This was a seat, Lutful Rahman as an independent after splitting the Labour Party, and there is a very complex battle going on in Tower Hamlets, lots of media coverage, recent panorama programme, investigations and inquiries set up, various. The police have subsequently, I think, reported, to choose my words carefully, found no reasons for further inquiries. And it's going to come down to a struggle between Lutful Rahman, the Independent, and the Labour Party's candidate John Biggs, who is a London Assembly member and used to be leader of the council. The big test here, I think, will be, can Lutful Rahman get 50% of the votes in the first ballot? And if he doesn't, can John Biggs get large numbers of second preference votes from the Conservatives, Lib Dems and others, with a hope to overhauling Lutful Rahman on the second ballot? That if anybody brings news ahead of me, lives in town and is following this closely. But anyway, so that's going to be one to watch to see how that ends up. Now, this is a chart that attempts to pick up the question, is London becoming a Labour city? To answer the question, is London becoming a Labour city? What this does, and this is for general elections, it's not for local elections, but general elections. It compares the percentage vote share in London for each party with the GB, the Great Britain vote share, in the same election, every election from 1955 to 2010. Now, interestingly, if you look at the far left of the chart there, you see very little variation between any of the major parties' votes in London and their GB vote share, suggesting that London, and this is still to some extent true, is despite all its differences in other ways from the rest of the country, is the region with a vote share most similar to Great Britain than any region in the United Kingdom. This was certainly true in the past, that the London vote share for each of the parties was very similar to their national vote share. In the 70s, Labour did slightly better, and the Conservatives slightly less well. In 87 and 92, the Conservatives did rather better in London than their national average vote share. Labour not doing too badly in 1992. But look what happens in 1997 onwards. 1997 onwards, the Labour bar jumps above the axis, showing that Labour is typically 5, then 6, then 3 in 2005, and then 7% ahead in London of its GB vote share, and all the other parties are then below. So the answer to the question, is London becoming a Labour city? It is slightly more so. Now, you'll know, I'm not sure anybody's researched why this happened. It started in 1997, arguably 1992, but certainly 1997. And so it's hard, therefore, to pin this change to the radical immigration that occurred after 1997, because this predates that. So my personal thesis is this is something to do with a sort of affluent progressives voting for Tony Blair. Now, I can't stand that up, that's just a theory, I have no reason to be sure about that. Well, the Blair-Brown government was one that affluent Londoners with their relatively high incomes and value of property thought that it was potentially worth voting for Labour. I don't know. But anyway, it certainly starts in 1997. And the great thing about general elections is they test these things in real time. So we'll find out in 2015 if Ed Balls and Ed Miliband are able to continue that trend, or whether that advantage for Labour disappears. Now, if you look for the London boroughs, you get something analogous. The same is happening and underpinning. So this sort of shift is also visible in London borough elections, but it's slightly more difficult to plot because you have to use the national equivalent vote share, because otherwise you don't have a proper benchmark. Now, what I've done next, just to not to have too many charts, which I apologise, but this is the Political Studies Association, so research I thought was important, is to do the same kind of exercise for a number of boroughs, just to show why there are, within individual authorities, and this would not be unique to London, changes in voting over time, which give us a clue as to whether what's going to happen in the next, i.e. this year's elections. So this is looking at the vote share in Croydon compared with the London-wide vote share. So we're now comparing the benchmark against the London-wide vote share, not the GB vote share. And this is for local elections. And what you see here is the Conservatives outperforming the London vote share in every election. and actually it's a bit lower in 2010, that's because of the higher turnout. If it were not for that, it would probably be in line with the earlier years. But what's interesting here is the Labour vote share, which used to be well below the line, and you can see in recent years has come right up to the line. So Labour is doing better over time in Croydon. This is why I believe Croydon will probably, on the basis of this kind of analysis and all else we know about the polls, change hands. But so that is why I've come to that conclusion. Richmond, I'm not going to do all 32. This is, I think, the second of three. Richmond shows how the Lib Dems way outperform here and have done for some time. Their London-wide vote share, the Labour Party massively underperforms, there's no contest. In fact, I've always been intrigued how from the West London boroughs to Land's End is a very bad, apart from a few cities, bad area for Labour. And so you have to say here, where the Conservatives have been doing reasonably well in recent years, and the Lib Dems also well, but what we know about national vote shares and the London polling was published last week, so on the basis of this, you have to assume that as the Conservatives control this, they will continue to control Richmond. There's not some underlying change going on here recently. Tower Hamlets show that these things go the other way. Tower Hamlets is a place where the Labour Party used to be absolutely dominant, used to be communists fighting Tower Hamlets in the early days of the elections there. And you'll see the Labour vote, which used to be way above the line back in the 60s and 70s, has declined nearly to being in line with the London performance. But look at the Conservative performance. We say gentrification doesn't affect voting, as large numbers of very different kinds of homes have been built in Tower Hamlets. The Conservative share is moving up towards the line, suggesting that, although I doubt the Conservatives will win Tower Hamlets this time, it's not inconceivable in the future, which is a remarkable thing. This is the East End. And it just shows you how, though I'm sure it wasn't intended to do this, a massive urban regeneration can, in my view, change voting. Then, towards the end now, UKIP. Let's just never forget UKIP. Now, it's very hard. It's worth saying, I'm sure Colin and Michael will say a lot more about this next week. UKIP, that's my colleague Simon Hicks, who's speaking the week after, I think, has got a very interesting chart showing how, if you look at the areas, the way places voted in the 1975 referendum, not stealing his thunder really, is it? But it will be still. The way areas voted in 1975, pro and anti, still in and out, staying in the EU at the time, and compare it with places that are Eurosceptic today, then places that voted to stay in the EU in 1975 are the places most likely to be Eurosceptic today and vice versa. Okay? So it was places like Sussex that were strongly in favour, voted strongly yes in 1975, which are now Eurosceptic today according to UKIP voting figures. And Scotland, after all, voted, I think I'm right in saying, no in 1975, and is now strongly pro-Europe. So
What's the reason for that?
Well, I suppose everybody on both sides would say, and I shouldn't raise this because I don't know the answer, I think it's because, in a sense, Europe has changed, Europe may have changed as much as the voters. The people in 1975 in voting, Mr. Wilson was Prime Minister at the time, were voting presumably to stay inside Europe, which was seen as a broad, Mrs. Thatcher and Harold Wilson were on the same side after all on this, going for yes. It was an establishment view, and Sussex, Kent and places like that voted to stay in, whereas in Scotland, I think it was probably the European community was seen as a more sort of capitalist club. I don't know, I mean, Peter will remember this better than me, but sorry, that's quite insulting. I did vote in the 1975 referendum, but I'm not saying I was studying. Anyway, you'll get more of this in Europe. I'm now doing a trail for the
But
European.
it's also showing that UKIP is more than just Europe.
It is. It's also about it's indirectly about immigration. Yeah. Anyway, I shouldn't have gone off on that rambling aside. My fault. But what point I'm going to make is the most up-to-date indications that we have, I think, is that where there is likely to be UKIP vote is UKIP voting in the London Assembly elections. This is the Assembly list. It's a PR-based election in 2012, where it'll be slightly influenced by the mayoral voting. You have to remember Boris Johnson is good at nuking these kind of votes. He's attractive to UKIP-style voters. But this is an assembly. It's the assembly election on the same day as the mayoral election, so this might slightly understate UKIP's attractiveness, but this is for the assembly list. So you see Havering, the far eastern borough in London, with Romford in it, getting 11.8%, UKIP getting 11.8%, Bexley, which I mentioned earlier on, 9.1%, Sutton, not obviously in East London, 8.2%. Now, and Bromley 7.8, Barking and Dagenham 7.2. So there's quite a lot of east, southeast and northeast in these figures. Now, so these are the areas that I would, and particularly Havering, both Havering and Barking and Dagenham have seen defections. In the case of Havering from the Conservatives to UKIP, and in Barking and Dagenham from Labour to UKIP, and indeed from Labour to some form of socialist Labour. So the politics here are quite fragmentary anyway. So these are the places, I think, in London where one would look for UKIP voting. Having said that, this year's elections, and this is what I was going to say, I'm sure Colin and Michael have made this point, are more urban in character than the rural elections, relatively rural elections last year, and therefore probably less easy elections for UKIP than last year. So, though they may well pick up some seats in East London, the chances of them picking up large numbers, I think, are lesser, personally, than last year. Which raises the interesting question of whether, in the wider set of elections taking place on May the 22nd, UKIP could theoretically come first in the Euro elections, but not win many seats in the council elections. Now, if that happened, I'm assuming we would infer that they weren't going to win many seats in the general election either. That's what I think the inference of that would be, that they could win large vote shares in the European election, but not. Anyway, these boroughs will test in Bexley, and I know everybody in the room's always had a major interest in Bexley politics. Bexley will declare overnight, so will declare quite early overnight. It's a relatively compact borough, and will give us, I think, an early indication in a Conservative Labour marginal borough where UKIP are a challenge of a sort of wider understanding of how the Conservative Labour fight's going, and the UKIP challenge to the Conservatives and Labour and its effect on Conservative Labour fights. So politics of Bexley are, in my view, very much to the fore. London Councils, which represents the boroughs, is going to produce, I understand, at least when I last spoke to them, a schedule of when the boroughs are going to declare. I don't know if you know more about that, David. So I think, don't quote me on this, I think up to a third of the London boroughs are getting counted overnight. And that means obviously the other 2/3, and I'm assuming these figures will broadly be replicated across the country. So there will be election results overnight for Friday morning, but many more starting to count on Friday and then declaring into the afternoon, and then of course another set of council declarations for Sunday night. That's it really. Now I'd say a few words about what these results might be more generally, with others in the room who know much more about this than me. As I said at the beginning, the great thing about London Borough election results, London Borough elections, is that they are a kind of general election. All the councillors in all the seats in London, outside the City of London, are up. London is still relatively, in voting pattern terms, like Great Britain. It's a first past the post elections. So if the Liberal Democrats do really badly, I think that will be a test of how badly or well the Liberal Democrats are likely to be doing beyond this and possibly next year. These are real elections, and the polling that the Evening Standard published last week, I thought, showed very interestingly how the public clearly could tell the difference between Euro elections, general